Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, people. I want to welcome you to my channel, and in today's video, we're gonna go over a clip from IG Intelligent with Jordan Peterson's. We are gonna have a few other clips, don't worry. This is a serious video, very serious. We'll have other clips, but stick around. This will be the main topic. The topic is in gender patriarchy. Oh. Evil man.
Feminist, you know how there's like a patriarchy? There's the patriarchy, the evil patriarchy.
That's serious, don't laugh. Serious video. In today's society, majority in the West, majority, don't forget that, majority in the West.
Kind of ironic that a white man is wearing a woman for Trump and a feminist for Trump when I consider myself a feminist. And
Did you just assume my gender? You said white man.
okay, I see your point there.
How do you know I'm not a woman?
I see your point. I see your point. I'll
You need
take
to
that.
check your white privilege, your white female privilege, I think.
You think?
A little
In
bit.
the West, people still argue that gender is a social construct. But let's see what the studies say and what Dr. Jordan Peterson has to say about this. Now, brothers, now. Take a big breath. Yeah, deep breath. Empty your mind. This is a serious video. It's gonna get heated. So, let's go.
Really interests me is whether this is, because you're arguing this is a societal thing. This is
Absolutely.
systemic imbalance within society. What I'm proposing, because of the fake, the Tinder hypothetical, is that actually this isn't societal. This is about what women desire and what they reward.
But even those
Sexual.
preferences are social, right?
What? This is some
Absolutely.
dumb
Are you, wait,
leftist shit,
no.
yo.
Wait, no, this is just factual, and I'll prove it to you right now.
Go ahead.
Okay,
Sure.
literally, think about the Renaissance, think about like the 1500s. What was considered the optimal form of a woman? It was a fat woman, literally. Like you could
Fertility. That was for fertility.
No,
Since you brought
yeah,
up
no,
Renaissance.
wait,
No. You brought up Renaissance.
No, yeah.
Fat
Zena,
woman
let
is
her
for
finish her
fertility,
point.
bro.
Let her
Right.
finish her point.
No,
Zena, go ahead.
You
Sure.
can say it was about fertility, but it was not just fertility. It was like, okay, fat women because it was a sign of wealth. It was a sign of prosperous, right? We had a period in time where being pale was seen as, a beauty standard. And then once more people started working indoor jobs, then it became, being tan is the new hot thing. So you can't tell me that like preferences aren't influenced by society because we
Yeah,
have multiple
those aren't
examples
so-
of
those
Hold
aren't
on.
social
I'll answer that right now.
That's a sign of
Okay,
wealth.
but you know what? I love that you mentioned that. Oh, well, it's a sign of this and a sign of that, but preferences change by what men like. But what has stood the test of time since the beginning of human time?
The male physique.
The male physique, that's one.
What's found as
But
attractive?
what has been universally found as attractive by women since the beginning of time between men and women relationships?
Oh, I know what you're gonna say, but it applies to men as well.
No, it does. Hold on.
You don't think men are attracted to wealth?
Listen, men don't have the same innate need for resources and security that women do. And the reason for that is because a man can go out and fight a lion or a tiger, hunt it down, kill it, and eat it. A woman can't, and she especially can't when she has a child. A woman by herself cannot gather enough calories to feed herself and her child, especially when she's pregnant and she's more vulnerable. So since the beginning of time, women have needed males to go out there, hunt, and gather resources and calories. It's only in this clown world new times that we have that women think that they can actually do things on their own, which, you know what, that's fine. It's fantastic. But guess what? You're a slave to your biology. You still want a man that can provide and capable of providing, even if you make your own money. This is why women that make their own money, make $100,000 per year, still want a guy that makes about $156,000 per year.
course.
So what I'm saying is, you're saying, well, attraction trends change or whatever, but the one trend that has not changed at the beginning of time is women have always been attracted to men that have resources, money, and status. That is why Genghis Khan owns all of Asia, and like people walk around, there's a percentage of a bunch of Asians that have his DNA in them.
I'm related
This
to
is
him.
why people, damn, okay. This is why, right, women have always shared one high value guy.
Satisfied.
What hasn't satisfied the ever-present human tendency towards envy and resentment, that's for sure.
So that's all that's driving it.
Not all, but it's a tremendous amount of what's driving it. And an absolute lack of gratitude for what we've managed to accomplish and what we have in front of us. I mean,
Unfairness, does that figure?
well, unfairness is a very ill-defined term. I mean, it's not so obvious either. It's not so obvious what's fair. So, for example, I got embroiled in a dispute the last time I was in the UK about the issue of the gender pay gap. And, from a social science perspective, the idea of the gender pay gap is it's so poorly formulated that it's almost staggering to me that people can even conceptualize it in this manner. It's not a univariate problem. It's a multivariate problem. Men and women don't make the same amount of money.
So we can break it down and then we can go through
No,
the
not
votes.
only could we have to.
Good.
And we can't assume that just because in all situations women don't make as much money as men, although there are some situations in which the reverse is true, by the way, that the reason for that is prejudice and oppression. There's many reasons for it. One reason, so there's a book by Warren Farrell, for example, called Why Men Make More, and he outlines like 42 reasons why men make more money than women. One of them is that men are much more likely to take dangerous occupations.
Well,
let's
have a go, if
fact.
not at 42, at some of the reasons. But perhaps just start by talking a bit more about gender with you, that unfraught territory, which always seems to go well. Do you agree with people who hold that broadly gender is a social construct?
No.
I
don't hold with those people at all.
Why? Yes.
Well, because first of all, that's an axiomatic pronouncement rather than a consequence of the analysis of the empirical data. And I mean, what do you mean a social construct? Genitalia aren't a social construct. Differences in height aren't a social construct. Differences in weight aren't a social construct.
What we deduce from our genitalia is to an extent constructed, right?
Well, because there's environmental and cultural effects on anything that's complex, and that's certainly the case. And differentiating what those are is a very difficult thing to do, but the psychometric work on that has already been done and done well. And when I...
What do you mean by the psychometric work?
I mean, psychologists in particular have spent 40 years sorting out an empirically derived model of personality. That's the Big Five model, which is well accepted among personality psychologists in the mainstream, most of who lean left, by the way, by an overwhelming majority. So there's no right-wing
It's a taxonomy, right? Might be five, might be six. I mean, they could be wrong.
Yeah, but one of the things that's interesting about the taxonomy is that it was a-theoretically derived. It's purely a consequence of statistical analysis. And so
I'm not sure where that's taking us on how far gender is socially constructed.
Okay, so the first thing to do is to figure out what the parameters are when you talk about something like gender. So the parameters are, say, parameters of temperament, because you said, well, we're not going to talk about the biology, we're going to talk about what's derived from that. So we might say temperament. Okay, so we know the temperamental dimensions. We know that they differ between men and women, and they differ cross-culturally. But more importantly, this is the crucial distinction.
Well, we don't know, because, I mean, I'm just looking at a piece of recent research on the brain, which concludes there are not two types of brain, and there are other researchers.
Who did the research?
It's the New Scientist. Scans prove there's no such thing as the male or female brain, just so you know what you're dealing with.
Nobody who has any sense would ever claim that there was a male and female brain.
Okay.
These differences aren't absolute.
But do you want to, so shall we just take that as a question? Do you want to engage that question on two types of brain, and then we can be a bit clearer on the question?
Well, there aren't two types of brain, and men and women are more the same by personality than they are different by a substantial margin. There's more similarity than difference.
If there's more similarity than difference.
But that doesn't mean the differences are irrelevant. So let me give you an example. So if you picked two people at random out of the population and had to guess who was more aggressive, and you guessed the man, you'd be right 60% of the time. That's about the magnitude of the difference between men and women.
Well, that's 60-40. It's not that much of a
That's
margin,
right.
is it?
That's exactly right. But, and this is where things get more sophisticated. All right, so then imagine that you had to pick the 1 in 100 most aggressive person and put them in jail, which is what we do. They're all men. So even though at the midpoint, the difference between men and women isn't that extreme, at the extremes, the difference is extraordinary. And most of the activity, or much of the activity in complex situations, happens at the extremes. So men are more interested in things than women are, and women are more interested in people than men are, on average. And those differences are largest in Scandinavia, by the way. So there's no evidence that they're socioculturally constructed. And one of the consequences of that is that if you leave men and women to make free choices...
Well, let's put aside that Scandinavia is not just one country, and it has lots of different cultural political differences within
Sure, but the point is that, and this is the fundamental point, is that the more egalitarian the country, the bigger the differences between men and women. The bigger.
I have no idea how one could possibly
conclude
that.
You rank order countries by their sociocultural, policies from egalitarian to non-egalitarian, and then you look at the magnitude of the differences in temperament in men and women in those countries, and you do those analyses
depending on
and
your
you publish
definition
them.
of temperament.
Yeah, but there isn't a definition of temperament that exists that's valid outside of the psychometric community.
Well,
and so this is
in that case, we're
science.
locked into a particular definition within what you call the psychometric community. And other people may simply say, look, I experience the world very differently, and I have evidence from my dealings, whether I'm a man, whether I'm a woman, whether I'm looking at how we get along together and what we do to improve matters, that doesn't conform to that. I mean, you know,
the question is then, what is the evidence? The fact that someone has an opinion about it isn't relevant. The relevant issue is what the evidence suggests, unless you're willing to throw out the scientific enterprise, which I wouldn't recommend.
No, I'm not. I'm certainly not doing that. But I do think that to pin it to a narrow definition of psychometric testing
it's not narrow. It's five-dimensional.
Recursive.
It's five-dimensional. It's not narrow. The whole world only has 4 dimensions. Five-dimensional model is actually extraordinarily sophisticated.
If it's got 4 dimensions and then we're into 5, that's magic.
Well, you have 5 dimensions. There's many multi-dimensional spaces, but reality itself has 4 dimensions, and there's plenty of complexity.
Let's come back to your evidence. Absolutely come back to evidence, but also to what you make of the evidence, because trading.
Well, all I make of the evidence is that there's multiple reasons for gender differences.
So what do we then do with this? Let's say that we decide that there are differences, and we can argue whether it's about the average. I mean, who is the average woman? Am I the average woman? Are you the average
in some ways, probably. In other ways, not.
Right. Okay. Good to know. So what do we do with this? So it takes us into this argument about what progress should look like. And the gender pay gap was a good example of that. As you say, lots of different ways of describing it, lots of different approaches to dealing with it. The challenge to you would still be, I think, do you think that the situation that we have is broadly fair in workplaces, and that women are self-selecting out of progress up the pay chain, rather than being, to an extent, under the pressure of child rearing that is not probably accounted for, or that they're not properly helped with? Is it really all about their decision, or might structures not play a role here? One doesn't have to be completely mad to think this, right?
No. What you have to be completely mad is to reduce the whole thing to gender and to assume that it's a consequence of oppression. There's multiple factors at play, and prejudice is one of them. The question is to what degree prejudice, or arbitrary categorization, let's say, and the lack of provision of opportunities for women is contributing to the pay gap, and to what degree other factors are contributing. So there's other factors. Like I said already, men are much more likely to do dangerous jobs. They're also more likely to do jobs that scale. So for example, because women are more interested in people on average than men are, they tend to work in people-oriented enterprises, and those are hard to scale. And because you can't scale them, it's harder to multiply the income. Men are more likely to move than women are. Men are more likely to take on trade positions. They're more likely to work with heavy machinery. They're more likely to work outside. All of these things add to the...
But if you cashed out, sorry to interrupt you there, but if you took out working with heavy machinery, which some women do, but more, we can say, right, more men will elect to do that. There's quite a lot of things in there where they're being nudged. We're all nudged throughout our life to certain choices. We don't have to accept the nudge. But then would you accept that women have lacked opportunities, that they've lacked? The nudge has not operated in the same way. So for you to say, end up...
Over what time span?
Well, you can choose your time span, say 100 years if you like.
I would
don't
say
really mind the time span. The point is, are women, in a sense, already going through a number of gates in life, and some of them are wider than others?
It's complicated. I mean, I think men were directed down narrow pathways in ways that women weren't. So, for example, they were much more likely to be conscripted into wars, for example, which actually happens to be a non-trivial phenomena, because it resulted in the deaths and the demolition of many men. And so both sexes are subject to the arbitrary strictures of culture. And perhaps you could argue that women had the worst time of it, although it's not that easy an argument to make. I would say that the extra pressures of child rearing and the inevitability of pregnancy played a very large role in that, and we didn't deal with that effectively till 1960. And so one of the things that I really don't like about the women were oppressed by men throughout history narrative is the fact that both men and women were terribly oppressed by nature throughout history, and that's not being factored into the equation. And I think that what men and women did for most of history, the decent ones anyways, was team up and partner up and try to make life the least amount of miserable for both. And yet we read this narrative backwards and we say, well, the reason that men and women weren't operating equally in the socio-cultural landscape was because men were oppressing them. It's like, sorry, no. That accounts for a tiny fraction of it, or some proportion of it. But it had much more to do with the fact that everyone was poor and miserable, and that women were locked into a reproductive cycle from which they had no practical escape. And we didn't fix that till the 60s.
What might irritate some working women, indeed some women, whether they work or not, is you can either sort of look at something like the gender pay gap and sort of pick apart how difficult it is, or you could say, well, let's try to fix this, and let's have an intelligent argument about how we best fix this thing. And the argument that women are self-selecting out of the workplace becomes a bit of a roadblock.
Yeah, but women do self-select out of the workplace all the time. Well, if you look at the legal profession, that's absolutely crystal clear. Women are overrepresented at the lower ends of the legal profession, but they stop operating at the high ends in their 30s, and it happens in all sorts of professions. And there's good reason for it. I mean, what happens? Well, because women in their late 20s tend to decide that they don't want to work 80 hours a week. They would rather have a family and devote some time to that, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do.
Another possibly reasonable thing to do is for the child-rearing roles of men and women to come more into balance than allowing, with some trade-offs, life being imperfect, allowing women to come back earlier into the workforce.
Well, yes, but that also assumes that what women want to do is come back.
That's never the argument that you put. You put it on the women.
No, not at all. That's not a fair characterization in the least. Your argument is predicated on the idea that the advantage to women is in coming back to the workplace. But many women decide, especially once they have children, that having their children and spending time with them is actually more valuable than going back to the workplace. And that's a reasonable thing to decide. In fact, you might think it's the intelligent thing to decide.
Well, a lot of women do then come back into the workforce, and their pay is then lower.
Well, that's something that you had mentioned earlier, and the fact that women pay a disproportionate price with regards to long-term career earnings if they become mothers. That's a very narrowly focused problem, and it's a problem that might need to be addressed. But that's not the same as the gender pay gap. It's a much more defined problem.
Yes,
and part of the problem is, how do we best...
Can we get you to carry a banner for that part of the feminist crusade, then?
Not if it's part of the feminist crusade, no. Because that would mean I'd have to carry a banner for what I regard as a rather reprehensible ideology. But I do...
Overall, feminism is a reprehensible ideology?
Well, what percentage of British women regard themselves as feminists now?
I don't know.
7%.
Well, it depends how you ask a question, I would guess.
Well, no, the reasonable measurements of it estimate there's something like that. It's a very small percentage.
Really?
Yes, really.
Well,
it's a very small minority, even if it's not 7%. And part of the reason for that is...
Would that make it inherently wrong? I mean, I'm not sure it's 7%, and but I think that's one on which we could all go and bandy a bit of research on the isms. But would it necessarily be such a bad idea? I mean, you must have sometimes stuck up for minority rights, even if the idea is right.
Of all,
as you say in your book,
women aren't
a
minority, by the way. They're actually a majority.
Precisely so. So in that sense...
They're not minority rights that we're talking about here if we're talking about female rights. Have I stuck up for minority rights? Yes. I don't see the world
Well, you've
from
said
that
the 7% example would suggest that even a small group within women thought that feminism was... You just decide yourself whether feminism's a good thing or not. It doesn't really matter.
Well, I think it's not a good thing because it plays identity politics games, and I'm not a fan of identity politics games and the collectivist viewpoint. I don't think that men should be set against women. I don't think that we should view the world as a competition between men and women. I don't think we should view history as a structure that pitted oppressed women against the oppressor men. I don't like that story. I think it's a nasty story, and I think it's designed, it's destined to divide us in ways that will not be good. I think it's a story fundamentally predicated on resentment. I don't think it's an accurate view of the way things unfolded in the past. And I don't think women were as powerless or as unable to contribute as the feminists claim they were before, like, 1960.
But earlier you thought things did come into balance for women in the 60s, so something changed. Something was good about the 60s, yes?
I thought that the birth control pill was invented. And the reason that women have far more flexibility, let's say, in their lives now is fundamentally because they have more control over their reproductive status. And that never really happened until the 1960s.
Yes,
and
but they may have built other conclusions on that other than that, great, I can control my fertility. It's great, I can control my fertility. Now what is the question that we're tussling
Well, that
with,
is, but that's exactly it. That is precisely the question that we're dealing with. But the causal is fundamentally because they have more control over their reproductive status. And that never really happened until the 1960s.
Yes,
and
but they may have built other conclusions on that other than that, great, I can control my fertility. It's great, I can control my fertility. Now what is the question that we're tussling
Well, that
with.
is, but that's exactly it. That is precisely the question that we're dealing with. But the causal order of that is, oh, now I can control my fertility. Now what? That's a biological revolution.
But that has consequences for men as well as women, right?
Of course it does.
Good.
And there are consequences.
So what do men have to change? We've had a lot of focus here on how women have had it better than that perhaps you think that modern feminists think they have.
I don't know.
Do men need to change?
I don't know if women had it better than modern feminists think they had it. I think that if women had it hard in the past, which they certainly do, that the amount of that was attributable to male oppression is far smaller than the feminists claim, because nature had her hand in that. You know, the average person in the Western world in 1895 lived on less than $1 a day in today's money. It's below the UN guidelines for poverty. So life was very hard for men and women for almost all of human history. And to view that as part of an oppression narrative on the part of men, I think, is one of the things that is very hard on young men, for example, when they're trying to take their place in the world. So how would men have to change because women have control over the reproductive function? That's an open-ended question. I don't know. Casual sex is much more available than it used to be. That's one way that men have been able to change. They haven't had to take on responsibility for adopting a long-term monogamous relationship in order to get sexual access. So that's a big change. It's also enabled men to not grow up to quite a great degree.
I'm not sure if you're welcoming that or
I'm not saying it's a good thing. It is very complicated.
So movements that bring, that whole difficulty of the mating game or the hookup culture into the debate must therefore be a good thing, and presumably you would also, I shouldn't use the word presumably, but would you welcome that?
I think there's very little good about the hookup culture. I think there's very little good about casual sexual relationships. I don't think they're good for men or for women.